Well, we're here now, friends, and a very warm welcome to all who've joined us. The first session of the conference organised by the Quaker Truth and Integrity Group. As you'd expect from a Quaker body, we'll start this and every session with a short period of silent worship. So could we gather, friends, please?
Bless your children. friends. And it's really wonderful to see so many friends gathered together this evening. I'm Linda Williams, and I've been asked to be the elder for tonight's session. So I'd like to say a couple of things about our meeting this evening. So as we continue, I'd like to remind everyone of the Zoom discipline because it will help all of us. So please make sure you're muted unless you're asked to speak. And also, if you need to leave your seat, please switch off your camera first. We invite you to keep the stillness and in particular to uphold our speakers and each other, just as we do when we're at meeting for worship in person. And I'd also like to ask you to maintain this prayerful approach when you're working in small groups. We need to listen to each other, and we need to make sure everyone has a chance to contribute and to speak. Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Linda. And before I start the introduction proper, let me cover some housekeeping issues and lay out the shape of the evening before us. As you've heard, Linda is our elder this evening, and if you feel you need Linda's services at any time, please type directly to her in the chat room. The topic of tonight's session is Truth, a Theological Basis for Quakers. And when I finish my introduction, Ben will give a short presentation. Then Rachel will add her thoughts, and that will lead to a conversation between them, lasting about 25, 30 minutes or so. At that point, after our presentations, we'll have a 5-minute shuffle break, from which I have to say, I hope you'll return promptly. And after the shuffle break, we'll be placed in breakout rooms for about 20 minutes. The task of each breakout room is to briefly review the contribution of the speakers, offer your personal response, and the most important thing is to formulate a question, an agreed question, to put to Rachel, Ben, or both. When you come back from breakout session, we'll ask one person from each group to type that question into the chat, and then I'll be able to see them and put the questions to our speakers, one, either or both of them. That will probably take the remaining session, but any remaining time, they will be able to have a conversation between them that we can listen into. And it was mentioned earlier, but I'll mention it again. This and subsequent sessions will be recorded and available to watch again on our website. So just to summarize, introduction from me, presentation from Ben and Rachel, shuffle break, breakout rooms to devise a question, and our speakers responding to those questions that you will have put in the chat. And apart from these two uses of the chat rooms, friends, the chat facility for participants is disabled. I hope that makes the shape of the evening clear. So I'll go on to the introduction proper. Friends, this conference has been called, at a time of crisis, every bit as urgent and compelling as the climate emergency. Just as the physical world we know is under threat, so the ability of our children and grandchildren to live in a flourishing democracy is also threatened. Rowan Williams writes of the dramatic evacuation of proportion, generosity, and candour from a great deal of public life. Others express it far more starkly. The right-wing commentator Peter Oborne calls his book The Assault on Truth, Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, and the emergence of a new moral barbarism. The left-wing journalist George Monbiot speaks of an epistemic crisis, the collapse of shared acceptance of the means by which truth is discerned. The Financial Times columnist Gideon Rachman argues in his latest book that we're entering the age of the strong man, in which authoritarianism is on the march and democracy undermined by those who actually win elections. And significantly, the UK is included in his analysis. In an article in The Friend, John Lampen drew a very bleak picture. We live in an era of post-truth, fake news, and promises which won't be kept. Advertising, either vacuous or misleading, stimulates the greed which is destroying our home planet. Financial misreporting is common. Social media provide platforms for rampant bigotry with vicious and hurtful personal attacks. But his conclusion is a challenge for all of us here tonight. Now, if ever, is a time for us to witness to our ancient testimony. It is no accident, friends, that this conference is called Living Truth, a rallying call for Quakers. The challenge in 2022 is as that for Quakers in 1652. Firstly, to be patterns and examples, that is to actually live out truth and integrity. And also, simultaneously, challenge our surrounding milieu, expecting and demanding better. So how do we witness to our ancient testimony? How do we build up truth and integrity in our country? How can we support politicians to maintain and build that vital integrity? How can we act with others? And in challenging times, what is it that we as Quakers are uniquely called to do? Those of us in the Truth and Integrity group hope this conference is the start of our collective response to such questions. We hope it's both a seedbed of ideas and a springboard for future action. Our best hope is for a release of energy so that a number of friends feel called to diverse initiatives under the aegis of a common concern. To that end, this conference has been designed as a whole. The 3 evening sessions taken together help us look at the problem in the round. Tomorrow evening, we look at social media and the use of algorithms, and on Wednesday, the work of politics. We do recognise that it's a significant commitment to attend all 3 evening sessions. So friends will attend as many as they're able. But no matter how many evening sessions you're able to attend, all are welcome to the Saturday morning session, when we will attempt to draw the themes together and agree a framework for action. Part of that work will be to draw up a clear statement of principles that will encapsulate our concern in the clearest possible terms. We want to use this to approach other groups, churches and faiths, hoping we might join together in a common approach to this crisis in our midst. We are excited by this prospect, even as we recognise that the way forward will not be easy. But now, friends, having outlined the purposes of the conference as a whole and the general shape of the evening, very pleased to welcome Rachel and Ben, Rachel Muirs and Ben Woods. They are here to help remind us of our spiritual heritage as Quakers and of our deep connection to the issues of truth and integrity as a foundation for discerned action. I'm sure they need little introduction, except to say that both have impeccable credentials to lead us in this. I'm personally really looking forward to what we're about to hear tonight, and we're very grateful for your presence, Rachel and Ben. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. Yeah.
I ask Ben to offer his thoughts.
And tonight, what I'd like to do briefly, and I hope succinctly but vividly, is to give you a map or a sketch of sorts for thinking about the Quaker tradition and truth. And to do that, I'd like to introduce to you the multiplicity, the complexity of how Quakers think about truth and being truthful. So to start, I want to give you a vivid biblical image, if my slides work. In John's Gospel, we have a peculiar scene, that of the Roman governor Pilate and Jesus standing before him, and the famous words rendered in the Vulgate text as vid est veritas, what is truth? It's a very irritating moment for philosophers and theologians, because just as soon as the question is uttered, we shift scene to Jesus outdoors in front of the crowd. The question appears not to be answered. It just hangs there enigmatically in the text. I want to suggest to you, though, that this apparent silence is not a silence at all. And as Quakers, we know what the answer is to what is truth, at least in a way. And that is that the answer to the question is provided by the presence of Jesus himself, a battered, wounded, tortured, and bereft man. Truth in this case is not an abstract idea. Truth is embodied. It has a presence. It has a shape. So when we think about truth as Quakers, we're not thinking about something kind of platonic and airy-fairy and up in the clouds. We're thinking of something concrete that we experience by living, by speaking, and by acting. And this framework of the idea of living or embodied truth is right there in John's Gospel where this scene is found. Elsewhere in the text, we hear, "Very truly I tell you, we speak of what we know and we testify to what we have seen, but still you people do not accept our testimony." So this is the challenge for Quakers, that truth is something suffered for, born in one's body, declared and lived out, which is a very odd idea of truth in lots of ways, because it's an idea of truth that goes beyond merely knowing the facts or having the right information. This was beautifully expressed by the Edwardian novelist Ian Forster, who, by the way, had a lot of time for Quakers. And the text is found in his beautiful novel, Howard's End. One of the characters says, "Your universities, oh yes, you have learned men who collect facts and empires of facts, but which of them will rekindle the light within?" So there's a distinction to be drawn, I think, between truth as merely knowing the score, if you like, or knowing the statistics, and the Quaker vision of truth as lived out, embodied, lived through, if you like. So what were the truths, or the bigger concept of truth that Quakers were trying to convey? And I've tried to summarize this in 4 key rubrics. The first truth that early Quakers cherished was the idea that the outward institutional church, the state church in the period, was not the true church, or at least it couldn't say everything that needed to be said under this definition of church. And we find this very much in Margaret Fell's famous words at Ulverston Church, where she says, "We are all thieves. We are all thieves. We have taken the scriptures in words and know nothing of them in ourselves." So it's the idea that just by performing church, it's not the same as being church. It doesn't exhaust the meaning of what church is. Second truth, public authority, whether judges, kings, magistrates, is not identical with divine will or Christian order. That just because someone says, this is the word of God, this is the church, this is the truth, doesn't mean it necessarily is, particularly if it's backed up with force. Quakers get very suspicious the moment you have a rifle butt or a sword to back up your claim of truth. Third truth, conscience, the leadings of God, should not be crushed in the name of public authority. That conscience, our stirred, tender hearts, should not be destroyed or silenced or contorted just because we need to keep society on the road. Fourth truth, and this I think is key, and it brings home something important for Quakers. Truth is cosmic, it is eternal, it is all suffusing. So what do I mean by that? Well, the way I express it here is that for Quakers, the big truth is that the world is meant for peace, unity, and restoration. When we live, at least temporarily, in states of peace, unity, and restoration, we are participating in the deep reality of the world. Stanley Hauerwas, Methodist theologian, calls it going with the grain of the universe. That's dreadfully grand, but we all know what's meant, because we have the experience of gathered worship, of deep silence and deep journeying and deep peace. And that's part of what early Quakers meant by truth. And all of these things are woven together. But this sounds lovely. But when we think about Quaker history, we know that it's not straightforward. We know that friends suffered, not only for their truth, but they suffered for the ability just to speak, just to be heard. And a problem arose for Quakers during their period of intense persecution in the 1650s and 60s. How do friends safeguard the truth that they have found, capital T? How do you maintain notions of shared truth and the revelation of truth in a radically fragmented society, such as we saw in England in the 17th century? How do you deal with disagreements between Quakers and Presbyterians and Anglicans and Anabaptists and Baptists and Muggletonians? How do you find a path? And this is what friends discovered slowly and haphazardly. The first important thing for truth making and truth finding for Friends was peace. The Spirit of Christ by which we are guided, says the Peace Declaration of 1660, is not changeable, so as once to command us from a thing as evil, and again to move us unto it. We certainly know and testify to the world that the Spirit of Christ, which leads us into all truth, will never move us to fight war against any man with outward weapons. So truth is never protected by violence or domination. Indeed, for Fox, the key to knowing and finding the truth is seeking the good and welfare and doing that which tends to the peace of all. So there is no finding of truth for Friends divorced from notions of the common welfare, of loving and praying for your enemy, as challenging as that might be. You could say that as Quaker community and Quaker theology firmed up and progressed, a series of key convictions emerged for Quakers in what we might grandly call a nascent political theology for Friends. And we find this, I think, most vividly and most strongly in the writings of William Penn. Now, Penn, of course, is an imperfect and contradictory figure, a man who talked about liberty, and yet he also owned slaves. It's just worth mentioning this. Nonetheless, he has some wise things to tell us. The first thing that Penn says is key for any attempts to find truth while looking after the common welfare is that the state should not impose any single orthodoxy on the population backed up with law. This is the way this is expressed by the Pennsylvania Charters of Liberty of 1701. No people can be truly happy, though under the greatest enjoyment of civil liberties, if abridged of the freedom of their conscience as to their religious profession and worship. And just to emphasize, Penn says, by liberty of conscience, we understand not only a mere liberty of the mind, but the exercise of ourselves in a visible way of worship, upon our believing it to be indispensably required at our hands, that if we neglect it for fear or favour of any mortal man, we sin and incur divine wrath. So again, we return to this theme of conscience. For Penn, people should have the right to disagree. They should have the right to dissent. And if you study Penn carefully, what you find is a principle that minorities must always be protected from overmighty majorities who might want to crowd out dissent or alternative opinions. Citizens in this model should have the means of seeking truth together through a framework of law and mutual respect. In some ways, this goes to the heart, I think, of the primary convictions of Quakers. I think it's fair to say that the history of Quakerism is, in some ways, a major contributor of what we call in the West liberal democracy. There are many wells to liberal democracy, but Quakers themselves have made a contribution to this tradition through a series of their own theological biases, their prizing of dissent, their upholding of conscience, their belief that minorities should be respected. Now, of course, you can always say these are self-serving postures for a persecuted minority. But over time, they became not just pragmatic ways of dealing with problems for Friends, they became tried and tested convictions. And this was exaggerated for Quakers by the doctrine of the inward light, the idea that we're all mirrors of divine reality. And just because you've got a big hat or you're the king, doesn't mean that you have a privileged access to this spiritual reality. All individual lives in this model are potential portals. They are ways of becoming perfect, I suppose. their ways into a larger life. And if we think about liberal democracy as an idea, now Quakers have always been divided on political particulars. Some Quakers have wanted more direct democracy. In the early 20th century, guild socialism was very popular among Quakers. Quakers have oscillated in Britain between the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and many other groups. But those key convictions around conscience and dissent have been essential. But I want to just return to the idea of the public welfare, the common welfare. Quakers have wanted to find forms of social consensus that avoid violence and uphold our testimony to peace. And this is, I think, essential. One final slide for you, friends, and then we can talk. There is a problem with Penn's vision, I think, which Penn himself acknowledges. In order to be a truth-seeking community, we require fragile virtues, fragile habits of thought, which go beyond simply using the blunt instrument of law. In order for truth to be preserved from forces of manipulation, we need trust, goodwill, a willingness to disagree gracefully, restraint, patience. Penn puts it like this: let the people think they govern, and they will be governed. This cannot fail if those they trust are trusted. Ouch. That says some quite uncomfortable things about our own political system, especially when voter apathy and upset and discontent with politicians appears to be at an all-time high, when it's very easy for us to fragment into umpteen groups. Penn believes that these fragile virtues, though, are the only road to truth. And I'll end on this quotation from Penn. We meet on the broad pathway of good faith and goodwill. No advantage shall be taken on either side, but all shall be openness and love. This is a tough call, friends, in the midst of what Gerald called a crisis. But without these fragile virtues, no truth can be heard, no matter how much truth is thought or willed. These fragile virtues, I think, are the only way. So on that ominous, but I hope hopeful note, I will stop.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. Friends, we'll go till about, I've got half an eye on the time. So I think we need to break at 1:45 so that folks get a shuffle break. I should say now, we didn't really introduce ourselves. I think we were going to, and then we just jumped straight in. But both Ben and I are based in Leeds, and both of us currently teach at the University of Leeds. It's great to be able to say that, Theology of Religious Studies. Back in the day, I was Ben's PhD supervisor, which set up a great pattern of him doing all the work and me grabbing some of the credit, which is what I'm now about to do. So here's something about your presentation, Ben, that really struck me, and I'm going to apologise because I didn't warn you about this in advance, because I only just saw it now as you went through the slides, where you list your 4 truths. And early friends, your first 3 are all negatives, right? Your first 3 are all, this is not the case, right? This is not the church as we know it, if you like, is not the true church. The state power is not reflective of divine authority, and it's wrong to restrict freedom of conscience. And that to me actually says something really important about Quaker theologies of truth, and the sort of account that I've given of Quaker testimony in the past, which is this idea there's a significant dimension of Quaker truth-telling that is about calling out lies, right? Or denying or yes, I think calling out is the right way to put it. Denying the lie that is being told, which includes the lie that's being enacted, right? So you can have a society that's enacting the lie that violence gives authority, right? That's a very commonly enacted lie, or that the world, the environment is a sort of infinite reserve of resource that we could just take from and nothing come back at us, right? These are actually untrue, and they are untrue things which are not only widely believed and said, but widely enacted. And one of the ways in which Quakers can speak and do truth historically and now is in resistance to the untruth. Now that's quite I suppose what I'm interested in as a conversation with you would be, did you notice as you were setting out your 4 truths that 3 of them were negatives? And do you have any thoughts about that? About the because I think there's also something important, isn't it, about the relative certainty of the negative and the sort of openness and fragility of the positive, right? We don't know what's coming. We don't know what the truth is. We don't know what the world in its right order will look like, but we know for sure, and we'll say that it is not this, right? So there's a confidence in the denial and the rejection, it's not this, which generates this kind of openness to the future that may emerge. But I don't know if that makes any sense or that works with your model.
I think this is quite interesting, because I wonder whether actually, because I did notice actually the kind of 3 negatives, but I think there's a really interesting way of framing this, which is to say we've got these 3 negatives and they're sort of clearing the ground.
Yeah.
So once you've got your 3 negatives, so sort of saying, you know, this is not the case, this is not the case, this is not the case, then you can start living into that cosmic truth about the world meant for peace, meant for restoration, meant for reconciliation. But according to your model, you can't do that until you do the calling out bit, which is the really difficult part. It's the
Right, and it's important that there is a positive grounded experience, right? There, isn't there? I mean, you know, friends are prepared to speak for liberty of conscience, not because, you know, in general we think this is a good thing, but because you have the experience of being guided by the Spirit of Christ in the conscience, right? And that's what drives the resistance to external constraint on liberty of conscience. So there's a positive given experience from which one can speak, but quite what that's going to work out as, right? What does a society look like if we live into truth? What does a society look like if we follow the divine guide? We don't actually know yet, right? But we know it doesn't look like what we've got now, and that's the basis for the truth speaking. Yeah. So yes, I think ground clearing is a good way to look. Except this sense that that it's always, I mean, I think this is your point about fragility is really important as well, because it's not a sort of preliminary exercise of ground clearing and then go on to the other stuff. It flipping keeps coming back, right? You know, this remains a conflict, a struggle, a challenge, right?
So I think maybe, you know, it's worth drawing a difference here around liberty of conscience. So the great defender of liberty of conscience and indeed, you know, freedom of speech in the English philosophical tradition is J.S. Mill. But the thing with Mill is that he doesn't have, for obvious reasons, he doesn't have a conception of the kingdom of God. So his idea of sort of liberty of conscience is sort of like a stasis position. It's the best. It's the best you can do without avoiding conflict. Whereas actually Quakers have a positive conception of liberty of the conscience.
Yeah, exactly. It's got direction to it. It's not just do what the heck you like, just as actually tell your truth isn't say whatever the first opinion that comes into your head, right? There's a very significant responsibility attached to the kind of freedom of conscience and freedom to speak truth, which somebody like Penn, I would say somebody like Penn is, or certainly Fell, is calling for. They're making an enormous claim then, because they're not just saying, oh yeah, sure, this is what I feel like, this is my experience. They're saying this is what I am being led to say, right? But just because it's got that, it carries that kind of weight, it carries that kind of conviction. That's what gives the force to the call for liberty of conscience, right? Isn't it? Something like that. Yeah, yeah.
But then, you know, the question I have, and I still have this question, even though I just talked about it, is how do you navigate, you know, radical diversity in, you know, because the kind of diversity that we experience in our own culture is comparable or indeed surpasses the kind of diversity that you had in the 1640s, 1650s. So there's a paradox, isn't there? Because Quakers are making quite a sectarian claim about what truth looks like and what truth commands them to do. But of course, it's interesting because that they know that this truth leads them to coexistence.
Yeah,
so
that's the point. Yes. That's why I think non-violence is absolutely fundamental, and there's this really strong connection between non-violence and truth. Because non-violence, this is where I actually want to put in a little word for facts, right? You're very down on facts at the beginning of your presentation. But there's something about letting all the facts be, even the inconvenient ones, right? Rather than trying to override them and overrule them and sweep them out of the way and destroy them when they don't fit the way you want the world to be, the way you want society to be, the way you want, you know, your narrative of what it is to be human. So there's something about the non-violence as first recognizing and holding what is there, right? Rather than sort of riding roughshod over it. So I think to me that it's not incidental, this idea, this really fundamental idea that you can't enforce the truth by violence. Violence is actually opposed to the truth, right? Violence is trying to get rid of or destroy what is given, what is there, what is the fact, right? You know, you're here, I don't like the way you are, I don't like the way you look, I don't like the way you speak, I don't like the thing you think. It does not suit me to acknowledge that you are also here and also a child of God and also given to me to live with. Therefore, I will get rid of you. And so this sense of the going together of truth and non-violence, I think is maybe one of the ways through the question about diversity, right? Because it starts with acknowledging, with recognizing what's there and what's given, and who's there and who's given. Yeah. Does that work at all, do you think? Is that one way one could go? Yes.
I mean, I think the tricky part always, and you know, we see this in Penn, is you know, what mechanisms do we have or practices do we have, not just as Quakers but as a society, for sustaining these fragile habits or virtues, as I described them, which allows you to hear truths when spoken, because actually you could say some really fact-filled and very truthful things, but if people are not prepared to hear them, or they distrust anything you say because they've got, you know, baggage, then your truth-telling becomes, you know, I mean, it's there, but it's not heard, it's not taken into account. So
and I mean, probably I hope that's what's part of the conference will come on to, but I think it is worth being realistic, and I think there's a lot of realism in the early Friends writings as well, that, you know, it's not that nobody's worth reaching, but sometimes, and this I think is true in the 17th century as it is now, sometimes all you get back at you is the propaganda, and that's not actually a meeting of minds, a listening, a conversation. You know, there is an actual blocking of the ability to speak and hear truth that needs to be worked through first, and hopefully this conference will have some thoughts about this. I wonder if that might be, Gerald, I'm mindful of the time, is that a good point for us to stop and take a shuffle break? Would you like to?
Indeed. Thank you ever so much indeed. That was, I could have sat here for a lot longer, but I think it is an appropriate time for a shuffle break, friends. Welcome back, friends. I think we've had a really good first session. It's now time for the breakout rooms, and that's the task for the breakout. Review what you've heard, offer a personal response, remembering what our elders said about listening to each other, and then before the end of your breakout time, devise a group question to put in the chat for when you come back. I hope that's all clear, friends. And I'll look forward to looking at the questions when you come back. Please, Chris, go ahead with the breakout rooms.
Yes, I think we pretty much have everybody back.
Right, I can see odd ones flicking back, but thank you ever so much for coming back, friends. And I was just saying in the break, there was plenty of meat in that first section to get hold of, I hope, in the conversation. So if someone from your group can now type the question in that you're interested in, then Rachel or Ben or both will seize these questions and chew them over for us until about just before 8:30,
Yeah.
and we'll close.
Not quite sure how much we'll have time for, friends, but we'll do our best.
Do we address those to you, Gerald, in the chat?
So I've got a message sent to me as a direct message, which I'm just going to try and copy to the whole group because it's come to me, but I'm just copying it across to everyone. So this came from Martina. So this is really interesting because this is just what we were talking about in the little room as the little group. Please, friends, do keep typing questions while we talk. How do we get society which has these characteristics? What's the first step for Quakers to achieve this? And then group 4 is saying in a way something similar. How do we do this? What do we do? How do we do this? So it's really interesting that this seems to be the focus for the conference, and how do we promote a culture that's conducive to truthfulness? So to some extent, these are not, I feel these aren't theologians' questions. These are kind of questions for friends in general. I think I want to talk about what friends have. As you might expect, I want to talk about what friends have got. What can we learn from our history? What can we learn from our tradition about what we can do? And I want to think about the really strong practices of collective listening that have been developed through things like Quaker meetings for worship and Quaker business practices, and the way in which that relies on. If you think about Quaker business method, what that's relying on is that you can hold together, hearing each friend's voice and experience, and collectively finding truth together, which actually is an enormous gamble. If it wasn't also an experiment in the old 17th century sense, it says that we've done this and it works. We know experimentally, we know from experience that this can work. So there is, we have got grounds for faith that it's possible to have this collective search for truth, and even just a sort of, in a sense, believing that and performing that feels countercultural quite a lot of the time, doesn't it? It feels countercultural in a situation where it feels like all that there is who shouts loudest, and just to have any kind of, to keep going with any kind of practice that says it's not true that all that there is who shouts loudest. I've got another message coming into the chat to me, so I'm putting it over to everyone. Oh, I'm getting quite a lot that are coming to me, so I'm trying to put them in the chat. Ben,
can I just pick up on a thread really about Quaker business practice? Because one way of looking at it, and I sort of alluded to it a bit in my talk, about the way in which Quaker convictions have contributed towards traditions that we might call liberal democracy, or sometimes social democracy, sometimes, depending upon where you sit on the ideological spectrum. But I think one of the things that Quakers probably bring to secular or the non-Quaker world is the idea that participation is a humanizing political practice. So the more we can participate in our communities, in what we call civil society, the more conversations we can have, the more we can learn about each other, and we can build up those bonds of trust. That's really, really tough. But I think that's probably the lesson for Quakers from kind of the 18th to the 20th century. This is why Quakers were busy in the old Liberal Party in voluntary groups and associations. This is why when the Liberal Party sort of faded, Quakers were like, oh, the Labour Party, oh, guild socialism, trade unions, association seemed to matter hugely to Friends in the early modern period as they tried to kind of give industrialism a human face. So I think that's kind of the bigger context in which Quaker practices and convictions are operating. They give Quakers a way of responding to the outside world beyond the meeting house as well as within it. It seems to me.
I'm trying to get the questions moving, Friends, but they keep coming directly to me, and I'm trying to put them where everybody can see them, which is tricky. Sorry. I'm really sorry, but I'm having a lot of trouble keeping track of it. We've got this idea, truth is not the aim of many people in public life. Do we need to say why it matters? I think so here's where it can seem like there's a bit of tension within Quaker tradition between, on the one hand, plain speaking, right, including being upfront about when something's a load of rubbish or a pack of lies, because there are a lot of lies around and they have to be called what they are. That on the one hand, and then on the other hand, all the listening, respect the non-violence of speech that we've been talking about. And so there is something significant about personal integrity. There's something significant about the being able to be vulnerable even when we're speaking our most that of which we're most certain and most confident, recognizing that we aren't in a position to impose it, we're only in a position to offer it, right? Truth spoken, it's always something offered out, and it might get taken or might get picked up, or it might get taken up and thrown to the floor, right? And one simply doesn't know, and we can only, because of this kind of commitment to non-violence, you can only offer it in a way that's, you know, this is what I've got. And does it speak to you? This is the answering that I've got in everyone, right? This is what I have. It's a calling out to you. It's appealing to you. I'm appealing to you for the value of truth. I'm appealing to you for a vision of peace. So something about, yes, I suppose I'd want to say we absolutely need to say why it matters, and picking up the themes from this question, relying on people acknowledging that they're fallible, weakness as a value, right? As a weakness and uncertainty as gifts, which is really, really hard to do in the current lots of the current environment of public discourse, where actually the sort of not just the loudest voice but the most sort of extreme or punchy line
so this relates, I think, to a question that Room 13 has asked. And it's kind of, I suppose it's pointed to me and kind of pointed to you as well, which is, why describe those virtues as fragile when they may be demanding or threatening? Like, I guess I have to explain myself. Do you want to explain myself to me, Rachel? And then I can try and, because I think you get what I'm trying to.
Well, it's something, I mean, trust is fragile, right? Both I mean, that just seems to be fairly obvious. So I'm now trying to work out why how I would justify the claim that it takes time to build trust and to win trust, and it takes one one letdown to destroy it, right? That's one of the reasons why I think the way Gerald spoke earlier might have resonated, right, was this sense that if we've lost this trust on which we were relying, how it's going to take time to win it back. It's going to take lots of politicians keeping their promise once one or two have publicly broken them, to make people believe in general that politicians generally keep promises. But if you don't believe in general that you can generally rely on promises being kept, then it's really hard to sustain a democratic political culture, right? Because we have to have some kind of faith in the people that we're elected to do what they're saying without us going and forcing them to, right? So that the sense that trust takes longer to build than it does to destroy, I guess, would be part of the fragility, wouldn't it? And then the virtue, this kind of virtue of truth telling, is actually, I don't know how you find it. I find this really scary, right? I am out in social media quite a lot, and it's a terrifying space. To say anything that isn't, oh, here is a nice picture of my cat, is extraordinarily intimidating. Just because of the ease with which conflict is resorted to, the ease with which fear is resorted to, the ease with which things are taken the wrong way. So I suppose that's part of the fragility, is the kind of courage that's taken to engage in good faith in a context in which folks don't engage in good faith. I don't know. Is that part of it, Ben?
Yeah, I think so. And also, yes, once that sense of trust and listening and mutual respect is lost, it is very hard to win it back. It's possible, I think. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of these questions are, quite rightly, I think, they're how questions. But I kind of think I want to say that we have some of the solutions already. We have institutions that may be in very poor repair, arguably, but they are nonetheless indispensable in thinking about truth. So there is value, if you don't mind me just being political for a moment, friends, in public service broadcasting, right? There is a value in having an institution which is tasked with people with the time and space to give you complicated perspectives and opening debate and giving you facts, to go back to Rachel's point, and then disseminating that into the public sphere. And then from that, you can then say, okay, we have these facts that we've established. Now, we might, have different interpretations about courses of action, but we have established sets of facts from which to operate. We have shared positions from which to speak against or to. Now, universities as well, this is self-promotion in a way, but universities are really valuable too, particularly humanities departments, which governments hate because they don't think it, well, some do, some don't. Yeah, but the idea that the goods that humanities departments do are not material or immediate economic goods. There are social goods around analysis and thought and reflection, and these are intangible goods, but they are essential.
Ben, we're gonna have to bring ourselves to a close because folks are going to need to go, and I think Gerald's got some, or Gerald or somebody, Linda, or somebody will have some announcements, right?
Well, the first announcement is say thank you very much for a very rich, stimulating, fascinating session. 2 sessions, actually. Thank you ever so much, both of you, Rachel and Ben. It remains for me to say tomorrow night is around social media and the impact that has on the sorts of issues that we have been discussing tonight. Wednesday is the world of politics itself with Molly Scott Cato, who was an MEP and is a professor of economics. I look forward to seeing people at those sessions if you can make them. Thank you once again to Ben and Rachel. Thank you to Chris for holding the fort on this complicated stuff called Zoom, and Linda for holding us so gracefully. And thank you to you, every single one of you, for joining us this evening. Thank you.
Been most interesting. Thank you for organising it.